Hey, we're Saints. Father Chris, Deacon Greg here. Welcome to our crucifixion live stream. Glad to have you beautiful people with us. Christ is risen. How you doing?
Truly, he is risen.
How you doing?
I'm fantastic. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I can't complain.
I'm happy to hear that.
All is well. So I'm going to start. Let's get it.
Go.
So I'm going to tell you, and I haven't told you all the details, although you know the high level stuff. Last week before, whatever, a few days ago, the young professionals group that we have in our parish had their monthly Bible study. And I went. And I went because they proposed a topic and they were going to lead it and they were going to discuss it. And the topic was, can we, as Orthodox Christians, as warrior saints, can we affiliate ourselves or align, I think was the word they use, with other traditional religions in order to combat the liberal progressive movement? And I heard that and I was like, I think I have to be there. Like, I need to make sure this doesn't go sideways. And what fascinated me the most about it, it was a fascinating conversation. There were more of these young people who were more conservative than those who were liberal that were there. Just numerically. I mean, it was like, I don't know, there's probably 30 of them. And it wasn't 50-50. It was more like at least 75-25. You know what I mean? And they were I was floored. I told the kids after, they're not kids, these adults, beautiful people. I said, look, I'm really proud of you guys because this could have been a contentious conversation, but you handled this with respect and dignity. I wish everybody could have this kind of conversation with that type of respect and dignity. It was really impressive. All of that to say, I lead that to get to this. In the midst of their conversations, they were asking or trying to answer that question, do we align ourselves with other traditional religions? They even went, listen to this, they even went into non-Christian religions, right? Like, can we align ourselves with Islam? Can we align ourselves with, maybe more conservative Buddhists or whatever? I forget what Mormonism they even talked about. And not aligning ourselves in their beliefs. But so here's an example. So before I get us in trouble. The Orthodox Church is pro-life. So if there's a pro-life march that is sponsored by Muslims or Mormons or, very conservative Roman Catholics, can we align ourselves with them? That was kind of what they were saying, not theological alignment.
Right.
Okay. So anyways, it was just an interesting exercise. All of that rambling leads to this. In the conversation, because most of them were definitely leaned more conservatively, the word Republican kept coming up. And they kept saying it, yeah, if you're a Republican, this. And I never said a word the whole time. This was their conversation. I was just there to make sure it didn't get out of hand, which it never did. But finally, at the end, and this is where I think maybe we can, a launching point for us. I said to them, look, how are you defining yourselves? How are you identifying, right? Like, are you a Republican? Or are you a warrior saint? Like, how do you look at yourself? And here's what I said, look, I'm neither, right? I'm not registered. I don't have any interest in any of that kind of stuff. But there are some things that the Republican Party does that I like and some that I don't. And likewise, there are some things that the Democratic Party does that I like and some things that I don't. But if I identify myself with either of them by saying I am an X or a Y, then all of those things become in some way part of my identity. And so the question is for us today, who do you identify as? How do you identify yourself? Who do you identify with? Let's say it like that.
Yeah. It's a really good question.
Well, look, I think it's important, G. I mean, I think it's so important because, in the world that's out there with this whole identity politics thing that people are always fighting about, it can get tough.
Well, I think it gets tough because, as you put it, in the world out there, everything, however we want to define that, you are being shoved in a box.
Right.
And once you're shoved in that box, then you are assumed to believe everything that goes along with whatever that box believes. And that's why then when the arguments start, because everyone starts getting fired up about these topics, as you say, they start calling you ists and they call you a this and a that and the other, and like there's no discussion, but there's also no internal discussion. So what I mean by that is the external discussion doesn't happen because it turns into a fight when you start going into boxes and everyone is juxtaposed against each other. But internally, you're not having that discussion of, do I actually agree with everything that I am now identifying as? We rather just identify ourselves in a certain way. Like, I'm going to use a really silly example. I am a Steelers fan.
I knew it.
You knew it was coming. You knew it was going to be there. I'm going to move my microphone so they can all see the helmet behind me. There we go. But like, as a Steelers fan, there are certain things that means.
Yes.
Right? That means that I don't like Cleveland. Sorry, Cleveland.
I like Cleveland.
Means I don't like the Ravens because they used to be the Browns, even though they want to think that they have their own history. Their history is that they were the Browns. So therefore, my history with them is that I don't like them. More people were upset in Pittsburgh than they were in Cleveland that the Browns were actually leaving Cleveland. That's a true story. Anyway,
So look, you said something. Sorry, go finish it.
No, but my point is, I am okay being aligned with everything that comes with that when I say the phrase, I am a Steelers fan.
Even the stinky towel?
Even the terrible towel.
Terrible towel.
I have one hanging in my office. I have one for each member of my family. And like it's a thing. I even have one that says #1 dad.
The stinky towel.
That's me.
I've changed his name.
Yeah, you didn't. But at any rate, we're not even going to get into the Cowboys. I have the Cowboys are like CD players. Neither has really been relevant since the 90s.
Oh, okay.
Wow, that was messed up. But my point in saying that is I am comfortable having this discussion right now as I say the phrase, I am a Steelers fan.
So
the minute I get into the other stuff, if I've not thought through, do I actually think all these other things? It doesn't matter. It is assumed that I believe all of the things and I align completely with all of that.
That's it. Exactly. That's where, that's the danger of it, because you said at the start of this whole Steelers tirade that if you say and identify as X, that it is assumed that but even more so that, you said it's assumed by others that you believe all that goes with it. The challenge is you are also beholden to that. I mean, if you're going to claim to be something, you've got to take whatever goes with it, which is okay if you are a Steelers fan because it means things that don't move. But in this political environment and in this identity politics environment, what the Democrats claim to be a part of and the Republicans claim to be a part of, or to be, their platforms, it's constantly evolving.
Right. And then you find yourself in a situation where you, because you are blindly following everything that a certain political party is going with, are forced to defend a point that you might not actually want to defend.
Absolutely.
But it has now become a part of something that you believe because you've made the statement, I am a this.
Right.
Now, the danger in that is, are you? And why then? So this is my question. You said, how do you define yourself? I think the problem is when we start saying I am a this, that, or the other thing, especially when we go down the identity politics rabbit hole, I am allowing someone else to define myself.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, and in some sense, everybody has to have a reference that they bang up against to be the defining factor.
Right.
But who do you want to be that reference? In other words, like, that's where we'll ultimately take this conversation, is obviously, hopefully God and his word will be that reference. But, as a Steelers fan, just to keep using your example, the Rooneys define who you are. They set that standard by having, not PNC, what do they call it? Yeah.
Acrisure Stadium.
Yeah. So,
still Heinz Field to me.
Heinz Field, right. So, they had a hand in that. They had a hand in its location. They had a hand in the colors, or maybe the colors are older than their ownership. But you know what I'm saying? Like, who is their quarterback? Who is their coach? What's the flavor of the team? They have. So as a Steelers fan, that is given to you. The challenge with meaning the reference that are the values. But what do you do when the values and the ethics of the things that are given to you are maybe perhaps from a corrupt source?
Yeah. Or what do you do when your Steelers ownership, who you are aligning yourself with, then start dabbling in games and political spheres that you maybe don't want to be associated with? How do you deal with that
Yeah, because
tension?
now you're stuck.
Because now you're stuck,
Right.
and you're still allowing someone else to define things about you. And then you're back to that being boxed in. I think this is great. And I'm really excited to see where it keeps going, because, I mean, how do you deal with that? Once you go into it, how far down that rabbit hole do you go before you start finding something else to be referential?
All right. I think great. This was excellent. I think right now, thus far in this convo, we've set a hook. We've got a question out there. Who defines you, and how do you let them define you, and so on. And I think hopefully in the rest of this conversation, we'll get to it and figure it out. But at least at this point, let it suffice to be that we're positing that question that we want everyone, all of our warrior saints, to reflect on, to think about. Who do you allow, or who do you identify with, or how do you identify yourself? What do you call yourself? What's your label, right? That's a great question. And even if we go no further in this conversation, even just to throw that out there and let people wonder and ask themselves that question, that's great. It's
Yeah.
great stuff. So as we move on, let me tell you something interesting, which is totally going to go in a different direction, but yet not. So in the defining of who we are, one of the things that I think that to go back to that original part of the conversation from the young adults, the young professionals group, dealing with liberal progressivism, that's what they kept calling it. We never really defined what they meant. They gave it a shot. But anyways, it was interesting. My daughter is a sophomore, as you know, in college, and called me like for some, editing and proofing on a paper she was writing, because she was in a class. Listen to this: the philosophy of imagination. Was awesome. And I was a philosophy major undergrad, so I was hopefully helpful somewhat. And she was having, in this paper, she had to write from an analysis of the professor himself, his book, and I think his name was Kearney. I don't know what his name is, the professor, but he wrote a book called "In the Wake of Imagination."
Okay.
And so she had to explore in this paper Jacques Derrida and Jean-Paul Sartre, and which I've read both. I mean, I had to read it in college, but just to say, and interesting. So here's the thesis: like Derrida, who these French intellectuals that came from the other side in Europe in the 60s, I guess the 60s, whatever. They started this whole movement, and what the thesis was, at least as I could glean from her paper and her studies. Jacques Derrida said, let's see, I want to make sure I get it right, but his thesis was, there is no reality, no truth. It is all imagination. And where it went was that you can imagine a brighter, I'm paraphrasing very loosely, but you can imagine, the truth is what you imagine. So you could imagine a brighter future. And then here's the challenge, that you can work and do the things necessary to get there, right? All right, so, and I agree with that. Like, imagine a better future and then go get some, right? That's what we tell our warrior saints all the time. But what do you do if that future that you are imagining, you decide is okay to use what others would consider corrupt means to get there? All right, not to be silly, but low-hanging fruit. What if you're Adolf Hitler and you decide that a more perfect world includes eliminating Jewish people, right, and all the horrible things that they did? Like, most people would say that's unethical. All right, Hitler chose to say that that was ethical. And Derrida's statement was this, that you get to decide the ethics, right? So there's no reference for that ethics. So if you have no reference other than yourself and what you decide to be your ethical reference, you could become Hitler like that. Now, I'm not accusing anybody of going to, using their imagination and becoming Hitler, but you can see the hole that this thought goes down. All of that leads to a follow-up convo question. When we've got to solve, what's your identity? Who do you define yourself as? And two, you got to be very careful about the ethics that go with that, or the reference point to tell you what is okay in that identity and what is perhaps not okay. That's a lot. I know. Stew on it. What do you think?
Yeah. I think I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, as far as the ethics goes, I mean, that's relativism, right? That's ultimately what the rabbit hole that we go down, that leads us to thinking it's all the same as long as you're just a good person, and then I'm the one that gets to decide what it means to
Yeah,
be a good person.
right.
And then, as you do you, boo boo.
Yeah.
You do what you need to do as long as it doesn't infringe on me. Everyone is free as long as your freedom doesn't infringe on my
Right.
freedom. And all this stuff that goes on all over the place, that we see all over the place,
Yeah.
that we uh, rail against in some ways all over the place, because it really just leads us to, I'm going to go down the narcissism rabbit hole, because that's ultimately what it leads to, because there's no other place for that to go than self-reference.
Yeah.
And once we get to a point where self-reference becomes our MO, our way of living, our general way of doing everything, then we have become the determiner of all things, and therefore we have become the height
Yeah.
of everything.
Absolutely. And what if you're broken?
Well,
Right?
yeah, but beyond just being broken, we all see the world through filters, and we all hear the
Yeah.
world through filters.
Yeah.
And we have to be deliberate about what those filters are. So first we have to recognize that they exist, right? And then we have to be deliberate about what we're allowing ourselves to be infused with, so that when those filters are being formed, and after they're formed, as we continue to develop those filters, we are deliberate about what we allow into that framework through which we see the world. So let's use framework instead of filters. The framework through which we see the world then becomes infused by whatever we're allowing to infuse it. It becomes so the sponge in the bucket of water,
Right.
right? So whatever we're letting in is how we're going to start developing and continuing this framework. We need to really be deliberate about what we let that be. So as you said, earlier, allowing God's word to be that reference then becomes important. Think about it like this. So we've been talking about the Noah story all over the place and a lot. I'm jumping straight into that, because Noah is declared righteous and blameless. We hear that in chapter 9 of Genesis, or chapter 6 of Genesis, verse 9, right? These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. That idea, that walking with God, he's declared blameless and righteous. Righteousness meaning he follows the law before there's even a law to follow.
Right.
He's right. He's blameless, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, is his cultic priesthood. That terminology, before there's even a cultic priesthood, before there's any of that going on. And what it really means is that he walked with God, which is what St. Paul talks about all the time, which is what we hear going on and on and on. It's that walking with God. It's that we allow the word of God to saturate our framework, to saturate our filters, so that everything we hear comes from within that framework, so that we're able to actually get out there and do what we really need to be doing.
Yeah, I don't disagree in even one little bit. Not except, but I say the word except to even go backwards a step.
Yeah.
The framework is what you implement after you have decided or chosen who you or what you will identify as.
So I'm going to push back on that, because I don't think it's ours to define.
What do you mean?
I mean that it is defined for us, and we have a choice whether or not we live that out. Now, I know I was saying earlier, when we start going down the identity politics rabbit hole, that we're allowing someone else to define us, and we don't want to do that. But what I'm saying deliberately is it is defined for us in the sense that we are created, as we hear, in that image and after the likeness of God, which then means we are called to build that, to work towards that, where as we hear in the baptismal service, right? Like, we are set on that path in our baptism that is that new life that we hear from St. Paul in Romans. We then have to work and continue to earn it, and to continue to work towards that, maintain it. We have to continue to maintain it. We have to continue the work that goes along with doing it. But the choice and where it is us making the choice is we decide whether or not we're going to do that work.
Yeah, I'm going to push on the push
Good.
because your statement is correct, but you must first decide whether or not you are going to allow God to be the definer of who you are, the identifier, right? Like, in other words, I mean, for us, I have to, and my teacher used to get mad. You think you have a choice. Well, yeah, we actually have a choice. I mean, unfortunately, I think he's wrong in that God is God. I get that. But I have the power, especially as a 21st century North American, to decide whether I want to follow him and be aligned with him or not, right? I have the power to choose a completely atheistic, hedonistic, whatever, pleasure-filled life. I can do that. But if I decide that I want to be a warrior saint, if I make that decision that I am going to follow God and do what he tells me and live the life that he tells me and try to be a good Christian and all of those things, then I am not given the right to decide what that looks like. He has, 1,500 pages of instruction manual, right? So, but the first point is that I need to decide, and this goes all the way back to the very beginning of our conversation today. I choose, and forgive me for speaking about myself, but I do not define myself as a Republican or as a Democrat or as, I'm neither. Like I said, I'm not registered, but I may define myself humoristically, is that a word? As a Dallas Cowboys fan, whereas you might define yourself as a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. But that's not a definition, an identity that rules my life. I define myself, I identify as a warrior saint, period. So what that means for me then is that as a warrior saint, the general of my army is God himself. And he will give me what you were saying earlier, the modus operandi on how to live. The framework was the word you used, right? So does that make sense now with all that I'm rambling about? So you decide who you identify as, but once you pick that identity, then there's a framework that will be given to you. I don't want the full Republican framework, and I don't want the full Democratic framework. Some of it, each of it is nice, but it's not the full framework that I want, right?
Yeah, you want the crucifixion framework.
Totally.
And when you go that route, then there are certain things that you have to do. And there are certain examples of that are laid before us of people who did that and who go and through that. And we see what the results of that are for them. Yeah, I think that's great. I think that your push on my push actually leads us to a place where we're all together talking about the same thing.
I think it's great.
And I think it's absolutely great.
Now, to go back to your Noah stuff. All right. So obviously the story of in Noah and God's, healing of the fallen world, the corrupted nature the corrupted world that man had become corrupt in his heart. It says, Noah is, so it's a fascinating tale, that whole chapter 6, 7, 8, 9 of Genesis, because God looks around at the state of affairs and decides that this did not work. This was a failed experiment. I'm gonna wipe them all out, right? Because it says, let me read it just to make sure I got it right, but in chapter, it's chapter 6, right, of Genesis. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord, verse 6, was sorry that he had made man on earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the ground, man and beast, creeping things, and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. Found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And then that verse that you popped up there earlier, verse 9, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, right? And that's that word, the walking with God. It's not like that they went arm in arm like on the beach and there was one footprints and then there was two. And it's not that. It's scripturally speaking, as you said, to walk with God means to abide by his commandments. We see that in the chapter previous with Enoch. Enoch didn't die.
He walked with God.
He walked with God
no more.
and was not, right? St. Paul, which you alluded to, like in the baptismal text of Romans 6, Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father so that we too might walk in the newness of life, right? that walking means that we follow what God has, the framework that he's designed for us, right?
Yeah. And we're invited into that framework, right? And then once we make the decision, yes, I'm going to do that, then we're bound by that framework.
Mm-hmm.
And we are held to the standard that framework is. And that comes with that framework, if you can say it that way.
Yeah.
And then to beat up on Mike Tomlin, as a Steelers fan, then when we say the standard is the standard is actually high. It's not mediocrity.
Yeah, totally.
It's the standard becomes the cross. I mean, St. Paul talks about that even further. He says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me, gave himself for me. We hear that in Galatians. It's this, I am crucified because the framework only leads to the cross. It's no more you do you, boo-boo. It's no more you are the reference. It is that becomes the reference.
Yeah, you see it. I mean, it's great that you pulled that out. I mean, Paul has given himself to God, to Christ God.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so he, in some sense, identifies in... I know it sounds funny to talk about the apostle like that, but for our conversation, I mean, he has declared himself to be, to identify as one who is in Christ, right? In baptism, right? He goes later in chapter 3, anyone who is baptized in Christ has put on Christ. He's, he's new. 2 Corinthians says the same thing, right? I think you've got that in there, chapter 5. From now on, we regard no one from a human point of view, even though we once regarded Christ from a human point of view. We regard him thus no longer. Therefore, this is verse 17 of 2 Corinthians 5. If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come, right? It's like what was once is no more. And Paul is saying, I think, I identify as a follower of Christ God, as one of his servants. Really, the Greek word and the Hebrew words are slave. That's the identity that he has chosen. And now that he has chosen that, he must abide by and walk in the newness of life. And that goes to what you were saying before, i.e. the framework. And really, that's what I guess our encouragement for all of our warrior saints today should be, is look, if you're going to say you're a warrior saint, if you are going to identify as a Christian, as one who follows Christ, you now have to walk a different type of life, a different framework.
Yeah. So my question is, did St. Paul identify as that? And maybe it's just nitpicking. Or was St. Paul called to it? And then in his answering that call to it, he then walks and follows and goes along this new path. And then that becomes his framework and he continues along that path.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know that Paul would have said that he is a Christian the way you and I would say that today, right?
Right.
I think St. Paul wrote before Acts, the book of Acts, and in Acts
there was
11.
no Christians yet.
I mean, at least by the lip. Who knows what was like then, but at least as we can find in the scriptural reference. The point I'm making is that Paul was a Jew, right? I mean, and he had some kind of encounter on the road to Damascus.
Right.
But then he sat there in Ananias' house for a while, and he thought about things until the scales were removed and he could see. And then he jumped into business, right?
Yeah. He was taught. He was taught what it meant to do it. He learned a new way of seeing the scriptures that he already knew so well. And in so doing, walks with God on his own path, not side by side. I almost bought you a notebook the other day at the Hallmark store, by the way, that was all about footprints. And it had, daily devotionals from the footprints poem. Anyway, I'm going to get it for you for Christmas.
I will use it for kindling. I love that.
But he walks with God because he is called to it. And I think that's where our professor of Old Testament would go down that rabbit hole and say that we have no choice. We're all on some level called to that.
Yeah.
The choice that we do have, though, is are we going to answer that call?
Answer the call. Thank you. I was just going to say it. Yep, absolutely.
Paul answers the call and becomes the greatest apostle and does all these wonderful things. I mean, the majority of the New Testament is Paul's. And it's Paul's interpretation of the Old Testament, which is the continuation of the story. It's beautiful, but he had to answer the call. And then he had to once he answered the call, be given this new form, way to see things so that he could see things through this new light.
Totally. And then that same call through the beautiful book is thrown to you and I and all of our warrior saints.
Without question.
You can see it in the life of Paul, obviously in Jesus Christ himself as the great, example. But that call, each and every one of us, every time we decide we want to be a warrior saint, we want to be a Christian, we want to read the Bible, we want to become, better, in our lives. That call is being thrown. Oh, what do you want to do? Right.
Right.
Do you want to be like this or do you want to be like that? And because you could get with this or you could get with that. All right.
Yeah.
I couldn't help it. And so as warrior saints, that call is thrown. Will you answer the call? Are you going to start living that crucifixion life, identifying yourself as one who is a warrior saint and go get some?
Yeah. Great. I think it's phenomenal. The follow-up then, why are we in this world with this identity politics then? And I think, I'm going to throw it out, that we're in this societal thing where politics become our new identity and become something that we fight over and that we become so bound by, because we no longer live in a society that has a culture. And that becomes our new culture. So we don't have something that is helping us to identify. So let me play it all out. I've been watching The Last Kingdom on Netflix at your recommendation.
Uhtred.
It's phenomenal.
It's great.
He doesn't know who he is anymore. And the whole interplay, I'm only in season 4, so
yeah, that's good.
But he's at that point in season 4 where he's very much confused who he is. He's no longer a Dane. And someone even says to him, "You're no longer Uhtred Ragnarsson."
Right.
He just tried to retake his homeland of Bebbanburg, and he no longer has it. And he says, "I'm not Uhtred of Bebbanburg. I'm not Uhtred Ragnarsson. I'm no longer the protector of the king. Who am I? And he says the words, "I am nothing." He is completely devoid. But up until that point in his life, there are cultures that exist, that he lives by certain cultures, and he has a framework that comes with that. We currently are living in a society that is without that culture, that is without a framework and a way to live. So we can't even say that the Orthodox Church is countercultural anymore because there's no culture for it to be there with. So we go after these other things that become new references, that become new identities that give us a definition of who we are. When at the end of the day, as warrior saints, as Orthodox Christians, we have an identity sitting right there in the book in front of you.
Yeah. We've got a culture. I don't agree with all of that. I mean, I know what you're saying, but I mean, it's a multicultural culture of which, and I'm not talking American melting pot. I'm saying that anyone can decide and be the reference for their culture. I'm a this, I'm a that, right? That's the whole problem of this, identity politics, is that you get to pick whatever you want and then you define it, and it becomes cultural in that sense. What we see, so the question is, how's that working for you, right? Like, it's become a chaos and a mess, and everyone's in total chaos out there. If I can steer it to in a different direction, not in a different direction, further, according to what this idea that you're fleshing out, is that our point to make is, look, we know there's all that other stuff out there. It's all vying for your attention and wanting you to bow down and worship. We're saying it doesn't work. We are saying that God's way is the only way that actually works, that the way of the cross, living a crucifixion life, is the only way that works. It's the framework that will take you from where you are to where you want to be, right? And I don't mean that, again, just in the sense of I live this life and I want to live forever in heaven. Okay, I hope it gets there too. I don't know if I'm going, but I'm talking about even in this life, that if we live crucifixionally, we can find ourselves where we are going to where we want to be. But I don't get to decide how that happens, i.e. the framework. Because if I were to, it would simply be just about me and getting what I want, doing what I want.
Right.
But that doesn't work. Christ
Exactly.
is telling us that to slay the monsters, it goes through the cross, baby. It's death. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this cherry picking and choosing and rationalization that goes along with it really is just about getting what we want, when we want, how we want it. Because we're picking and choosing the things that we decide are our culture. And in picking and choosing these things, we are now being self-referential.
Yeah.
And in our picking and choosing and making all of these hodgepodge things, there is, again, no culture, right? Like, we've just got 70,000 cultures. Like, there's a new culture for every religion that exists, right? Or every denomination. There's well over 220 denominations of Christianity in the U.S. alone.
No, not 220, like thousands.
Fine.
Right.
Even better.
Of which the new religion of politics is one that, and I know you've talked about this before in some of your own teachings and thoughts, that politics is now its own religion. It's a religion that people, subscribe to.
It is. And the Battle of Gettysburg was fought between the North and the South, because the North and the South, and I mean, it's more complicated than this, fine. But the North and the South inherently had two different cultures that went to war with each other. We are no longer in the culture wars. We are in the cola wars, which we're not even in those anymore over Coke or Pepsi, right? Like, Coke has dominated everything except Western Pennsylvania, where we still like Pepsi more than everything else. And how do we get through it all, right? Because we're ships lost at sea in many ways through this. And I for warrior saints, then Scripture becomes the answer.
Yeah, it's the reference. You have to look at it. You have to, so I guess to answer directly, why would you choose God? Well, the statement is ultimately that, obviously, I would say that his way works. But the proof, if you will, in the pudding is that when Christ was crucified, he was raised by the glory of the Father on the third day, and in so doing, he conquers death, sin and death, right? The biggest monsters of all time. Luke Skywalker conquered the Empire and dealt with Darth Vader. Okay, great. That was awesome. We appreciated that because it was very grim.
Yeah.
But even bigger than that monster is sin and its outcome, death. And so Christ conquers that with the weapon of the cross. That's the lure, right? And it comes because life eternal is promised to those who follow him. Like,
right.
That's the promise. All right. So if that's the case, then you have to deal with him, God, and his Christ. And excuse me, and you have to deal with his commandments and his words. And his words are, hey, you need to take up your own cross and follow me.
Right.
You need to put your own will aside in order to do my will. But if you do that, it works, right? And the proof is that I've raised my son from the glory from the dead on the third day by the glory of the Father, as Paul says in Romans, right? So I know it sounds crass for me, but there's proof in the pudding.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want it, you got to follow. You got to do the same thing, which is why we always say we must live a crucifixional life, which I think comes down to the sacrifice of self for the sake of other, like the sacrifice of my will in order to do God's will. It becomes in a world, and even though you said, and rightly so, that we are no longer in a culture, we are in a culture of cultures, 70,000 cultures, right? All of them, or at least let's say the lion's share of it is self-focused.
Yeah.
But we need to learn to be, and I struggle with it too. I'm equally as guilty, but we need to struggle to be selfless, which is Christ on the cross, which is crucifixional, which means to sacrifice ourselves for other to do God's will.
Yeah. And it's hard as heck.
Yes, it is.
Yesterday, I took a friend to the airport. I picked up my daughter from school, and Then I went, and instead of just picking up my daughter from school, I went and picked up my son from his school. And now I'm driving back from the airport at 5 o'clock in the afternoon with 2 kids in the car who are getting hungry and fighting over whatever they decided to fight over in that moment in the back seat of the car. But my wife came home to an empty house that was quiet and said to me, I haven't come home to an empty house that's quiet in I don't know how long. Right. So the point of why I was doing it, as difficult as it was, as miserable as it might have been, the point of why I was doing it was so that she had that few moments of peace. I got my own 5 minutes of peace earlier, like last week, when I took a Waymo for the first time, and it was actually completely silent.
Yeah.
And it was completely silent in a car. Now, for those of you that don't know what Waymo is, it is an autonomous driver, which means that no one is driving the car, which means that no one is making small talk with you while you're sitting in the back seat, unlike an Uber where you have to talk to your Uber driver because they're going to rate you on your friendliness and how your conversation was. You now are just free to sit in silence, to sit with music or whatever, and you have that moment of peace. My crucifixional living, to use this trite example, was trying to find that for my wife and give her those same moments.
Yeah. Awesome. Glad you did that. I mean,
But it was hard.
I bet. No, and your kids I love, obviously I'm biased, but they're small children. I mean, 4 and 2, that's a lot. And your bride deserved that moment. I mean, I think that's the whole thing, is that we, like everything we see around us is pushing us into focusing on ourselves.
Uh-huh.
Right? Like you always say, you do you, boo boo. And then we always comment where we live here, there is a local casino on reservation land, and their slogan that they do, their advertising is you do you, right? We make fun of Burger King, have it your way, you rule. And we make fun of L'Oreal, because you're worth it. And you know what I mean? We make fun of Apple, the iPhone, right? I mean, everything it's all
self.
Yeah, everything's pushing that direction. I mean, it's just thrown at us. So it's hard. I mean, it's hard to deal with that. But when we start to become sacrificial, it's interesting. How about this? This is totally off track, but I noticed that in my own experience, and definitely when our people in our community here go out and serve others, they feel awesome.
Yeah.
Like, when we go it sounds silly, but going to a soup kitchen and serving someone food, giving something away that's yours to someone else for their benefit always feels great. And I know, again, silly trite examples, but those things are kind of proof in the pudding that Christ's way works.
Well, not only proof in the pudding that Christ's way works, but proof in the pudding that that's what we're supposed to be doing. If
You're built for it.
We're built for it. When we're doing the stuff that we know we're not supposed to be doing, we feel miserable. We know that it's not right. We know that something is off. And we feel almost like we're in a hot furnace of despair crushing us under whatever, because we know that we're not living life the way that we're supposed to be living. We know that we're creating a different reference.
Yeah, we're off track.
And we know we're off track.
Yeah. I mean, you can feel it. It's self-evident. All right, great stuff. I loved it. That was a good thread. Maybe as we switch threads, let's just say that we are trying very hard to identify as a warrior saint and do what we're supposed to be doing, living the way God has called us to live, following his word. And then persecution pops. Like, you and I both have faced backlash for our teachings, and hopefully we're teaching. I think we're teaching the gospel to the best of our ability. And, we have not said anything that's outside of the bounds of that. Although sometimes the culture doesn't want to hear it because it's calling them into selflessness and, and to abandon selfishness. It's saying hard things. It's saying you're wrong. It's saying, like, come back to the light, brother, come back. What do you do, and how do you face, how do you confront when you get called out that your identity is somehow wrong? And you said it earlier, when people claim this stupid stuff we have to freaking listen to, but your identity is oppressive, right? Or like you said, the word, you become an ist, or you become part of an ism. You know what I mean? When you're just speaking truth according to God's word, and you get attacked.
Carefully.
Yeah, it's hard, man. It's a heavy weight sometimes.
It's very heavy because everyone is so locked into this idea of dichotomy that we can't see that people sometimes are thinking outside of that dichotomy, right? So we talk all the time, people talk all the time about you have to think outside the box. You have to think outside the box. But they want you in a box, right? They want you to be in something that they can define,
right?
That they then can understand, so that they then can know whether or not they like it.
And they can control you.
And then they can control you.
Here's the challenge. When you want to bust outside the box, they throw those labels at you and you get, uncomfortable and you want to stay in the box. Look, we did a whole series. I mean, I encourage everyone, watch our series on Revelation. It's on our website, warriorsaints.org. We have a series, a course, Understanding the Bible, which is that. We try to teach to the best of our ability so that people can understand the Bible. We did a whole series on Revelation, and that whole thing, the whole thesis of the book of Revelation, the whole impetus is that Christians were, early century, obviously, Christians were abandoning their faith because the Romans were throwing them to the lions, right? They were saying, no, you can't get out of this box. You got to, and be a Christian. You have to come back and worship the pagan gods. Maybe we'll let you worship like the Jews, but otherwise we're going to throw you to the lions, right? And some people were abandoning. So it was encouraging them to, the book, stay strong, even if you lose your life. So you and I, thank God, we may not be fed to the lions literally today, but when we speak truth, we do face that backlash, and people are saying, no, get back in the box, right?
Yeah.
Made me think Revelation, which is very well connected to the book of Daniel. And you said earlier, the furnace, that whole story in chapter 3 where Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were, in favor with the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, because they had interpreted dreams. But then in chapter 3, he says, hey, everybody, worship me. I'm going to build a big statue of me and worship. And when you hear, I forget exactly, but the sound of the lyre and the trigon and the harp and the,
sackbut.
Yeah, all that stuff, you have to bow down before the image. And these three guys said, we're not doing that. And he gets enraged. I mean, he's going to kill them. And he says, what are you doing? Why will you not? Let's read it. I mean, now, if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music to fall down and worship the image which I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. That's what you were talking about earlier. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. And it's simple. It's clear. Look, God can save us. You're going to throw us. We're not going to bow down. Then you're going to throw us into this burning fiery furnace. Our God can save us. Although he may choose not to. I don't know. We can't speak for him. But even if he doesn't, we are so well identified as his servants, we will go to the fiery furnace, but we're not going to bow down.
Yeah. Because they had a culture that defined them that way. They were from a place where that was what they did. That was how they lived. That was who they were.
Well, they heard the call.
And they answered
it, and they weren't going to waver, even if it meant a horrible, fiery death. And that's the challenge that I think that, as warrior saints, that's the challenge of our identity. Once you say it, man, you've got to go, and it's going to be freaking hard.
Yeah.
Because there will be times where people will come after you. Well, it's hard because living a crucifixion life means sacrifice. But on top of that, you are going to face persecution, and you will feel that temptation to waver and blend in with the modern cultures.
Right.
And, and kind of kowtow to what you believe and not to what they believe and not really stick true. But the challenge is don't waver.
Right.
Endure.
endure to the end, which is from Revelation. And the life of St. Ignatius of Antioch talks about this clearly. I mean, he writes in his letter to the Romans that don't stop them from killing me in the lion's den. I am pure wheat. He refers to himself as an offering made to God. And then he ends that section with, then I will truly be a Christian. Then will I have actually earned the name.
Right.
He will actually live out what it means to fully do what it means to take up his cross and follow Christ.
Absolutely.
Going to that persecution willingly, voluntarily. I mean, Christ talks about it in the Beatitudes when he's in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. Like it's what we're called to. We're called to the persecution. If we then shy away from the persecution, then we're not really doing it.
Because you're not proving it. Look,
Right.
the Ignatius thing you brought up is awesome. Like that whole statement about, then I will have earned the name. Like, look, I identify, says St. Ignatius, as a Christian, right? Well, do you? What are you going to do when the lions are on the line? And Ignatius said, baby, I'm going.
Right.
He then earned that name. And so and you and I don't have to face the lions today. Literal lions. There are other metaphorical ones that are nasty and after us. And so that's the question that we pose to everybody out there. Maybe we wrap this all up here, like with this exhortation, is to say, look, we're calling all to be, not we. God is calling all men and women to be warrior saints, to be Christ-like warriors for the gospel and to sacrifice and be crucifixional. And many people answer the call with joy and do so until it gets hard. And then they kind of waver and are, like you said earlier, lukewarm with it. Mm-hmm. But the challenge is that in the face of hard, in the face of struggle, in the face of persecution, stay strong, baby, don't waver. Because in that commitment is life. And it may be after death in this world, but there is life. That's the whole message. And I think it's, that we would just exhort our warrior saints, stay strong.
Yeah.
Great stuff.
Great stuff.
I love it. Well, we'll be back. Good. We're going to do this again. We will be back as we are, as always, next week. But we will see you Sunday for Orthodox and Liturgy at 9 and 10 a.m. Pacific time. Great stuff. Enjoyed it. Have a great one. Love you, beautiful people. And as always, keep walking on the way of the warrior saint.